The while, do, and for statements are known as iteration statements. You can use them to perform operations while a specific condition is true. The do and the while statements repeat execution that's embedded in statements as long as a Boolean expression is true. So you can think of the do and the while as looping constructs. The expression that the while statement evaluates must be a Boolean. Now remember, C# does not support implicit conversion from an integer to a Boolean value. So the statement itself, again, has to evaluate to a Boolean. Let's take a look at some examples with while and do. In this first example, you'll see that an integer has been declared as 0 at the very top here. Now this is a while loop, which means that the first thing that happens is this expression is evaluated. If this expression is true, then you move on to the embedded statements and you execute those. So x is incremented by 1 within the while. You reach the end of the while, and then you transfer control back to the condition again to see if it still evaluates to true. And if it evaluates to true, you go back into the embedded statements and execute once again. And you repeat that process until your condition evaluates to false. When it evaluates to false, you exit the while loop. Now notice what is really unique about the while loop is that it's quite possible that the embedded statements within the while will never get executed. That is to say, at the very first time you evaluate that expression, if that evaluates to false, you'll never go through the loop and hit the embedded statements. That's a little different than a do loop. If you take a look at a do loop, you'll see that the evaluation doesn't happen until you hit the bottom of the loop. So at the very top of a do loop, there is no condition. You fall right through and execute your embedded statements, and then you evaluate whether or not the condition is true. In a do loop, it's guaranteed that your embedded statements will execute at least once. With a while loop, you can't make that guarantee because when you jump right into a while loop, the expression is evaluated at the very top. That really points out the difference between a do loop and a while loop. Now what we'll do is we'll take a look at a different type of statement, and that's the for statement. When using the while statement, developers often forget to update their counter control. So what happens is you could generate an infinite loop. Let's take a look. In this example, you've got a variable that becomes your counter variable. That's what's going to push you through the loop, and as you increment, at some point, x is no longer going to be less than or equal to 5. That's what's driving that, is that line of code right here. You might forget that line of code, and now you have an infinite loop. X never gets incremented or decremented. It never gets changed within the embodied statements, so you have an infinite loop. What the for loop attempts to do is it attempts to break that problem. Let's take a look. We've got a for statement or a for loop. The very first part of this is the initializer. That's the same thing we saw when we looked at that while loop. There was an initializer at the top. So the first part of this maps to just a general initializer variable or counter that you would use in an everyday ordinary while loop. The next piece is your condition. X is less than or equal to 5. So as long as that's true, you want to keep looping through this for statement. That maps directly to the condition that we saw in the while loop, while x is greater than or equal to 5. This is really what we were talking about before, and that becomes the counter or the updater. In a while loop, that updater is actually inside the loop. Now we could express the incrementing like that, or we could express it the way we did before. Both of those are doing basically the same thing. But the updater is at the top of the for loop, and the updater here is somewhere in the middle. So the for loop really has the same components as the do or the while loop. The difference is that all of the components are listed at the very top. So this will be where x gets initialized. X starts at 0. This is the condition that you're trying to evaluate. And this is the counter or the updater. Now keep in mind that you could actually generate an infinite loop using a for as well. Let's take a look at that. A quick way of creating an infinite loop using a for statement is just to leave out those three components. That's common syntax for an infinite loop. We took a look at three statements: the do, the while, and the for statement.